Hey everybody, welcome back to Modo with Ellery, and in this episode we're going to take an introductory look at cloth dynamics inside of Modo. Now this is a topic that we'll cover in several different episodes, and that we'll look at different aspects of soft body simulation and a lot of the things that you can do with it. But in this introductory video, what we're going to do is just look at the simple application of cloth dynamics to create a basic scene and use those cloth dynamics to help us have a finished item to render. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to take, I've got three items here in this scene, and you can see the first item that we have here is a sphere, and then we have a plane, and that's just going to be sitting as the ground plane. And then I've got an empty mesh layer here, which we can actually just get rid of. So let's go ahead and delete that. And then we have plane 2, which is going to be the cloth. So I'm going to go ahead and rename this one cloth so that we know what we're dealing with. And the plane and the sphere are just going to be our collision items. And then the cloth is going to collide with them. What we're going to do is just drop the cloth down so it drapes over the ball and then kind of rests on the floor underneath. And the reason that we have these in separate items, at least as far as the sphere and the plane go, is that we want to be able to use good collision items, so good collision geometry to go with each of these. And we don't want to have to worry about both items being in one mesh item, and then we have to collide with something different than just a basic plane and a sphere. So with that, let's hop over into the Setup tab. And let's actually start putting this together. So I'm going to start just by taking the cloth, and let's go over to item mode, and I'm going to move it up in the air. So we'll put it up, about here, so it has a little ways that it can fall, kind of gain some momentum. And now what we have here is we have this piece and this piece, the sphere and the ground, are not going to move. So we want to set these up as static bodies. So let's go ahead and select this sphere, and I'm going to set that to static rigid body, select the ground, static rigid body, and we're going to hop over here to the dynamics tab on each of these. And we want to make sure that these have the proper collision shape. So for the ground here, the collision shape is set to plane. And that's good because as a plane collision item, it's actually going to extend off the edges. The cool thing here is you could actually have a plane that's, just postage stamp size in the middle, and it's not going to matter because the plane collision shape is going to deal with that two-dimensional plane. So it's going to essentially make a ground plane that extends off in all directions. So you don't need to have something this big, but just for demonstrative purposes, I've got it larger here. And then let's hop over to the sphere, and we can see that the sphere's collision shape is also sphere. And the important reason to have this as an actual sphere instead of using mesh or hull or anything like that is that what it will do is it will take the very center of the object space, and it will project out a radius in all directions, and it's going to be a very simple geometric shape for the collision to deal with. And it's also going to be a nice sphere shape, so we don't have to worry about the fact that a polygonal or sub-D sphere is not 100% perfectly round. We'll actually get a perfectly round collision shape. All right, and now let's hop up to our actual cloth item. And you can see that I've got this set to a pretty low resolution to start here. It's a 16 by 16 grid, so not really high density. And one thing to remember when you're working with cloth, and something that's going to take a lot of the frustration out, is that you start based on a lower resolution and move up. And you can think of this a lot like rendering. You don't set your render resolution to something like 30 megapixels and hit render while you're still testing out your materials and your lighting. It wouldn't make any sense, because by the time it renders out, it's going to be hours later, and you've wasted all that time, and then you go, oh, you know what? I forgot to apply one of the materials or whatever. Same kind of thing goes here with cloth. It doesn't do us any good to start with a massively dense grid just right off the bat, because as we're adjusting some of the initial parameters, we're going to see that a lot of those are going to apply at any resolution. And then once we add the resolution, what that's going to add in is a lot of the detail and the nuance that's going to make it look more clothy. Yeah, it's a word, clothy. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with this 16 by 16 grid. I'm going to go ahead and apply the soft body to it. And then we'll go here and check the dynamics tab, and we can see that everything is set at the moment at just the default settings. So the The stiffness, struct, and shear, which we'll go over here in a minute, are defaulting to 0.5, 0.98, and 0.5. The number of clusters, that's essentially the resolution of the solve, is set to 16, which is pretty low, and we'll look at increasing that here in a bit. Friction is 60%, and margin is 40 millimeters. Now, margin is going to be something we're going to want to deal with here, and part of this is going to depend on how you want to work with the scene. In this case, I want to end up with a frozen mesh that's just sitting still in space, not animating at the very end here. And I'm going to want to see things collide well with each other and not have big gaps. Now, part of that is going to be unavoidable, and we'll look at how to fix those gaps. But what we want to see is we want to minimize this as much as possible. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at all these margins. They're all set to 40 millimeters. So I'm going to select all of these items, and I'm going to set the margin. Here, let's just do these one at a time. I'm going to set the margin down to something lower, and I'm going to go down to 10 millimeters. Now, the problem that we'll get with something as low as 10 millimeters is that we're going to get some inter-object penetration, especially between the sphere and the plane, the cloth here. But in the end, I'm not really going to end up seeing the sphere. So what I'm going to do for renders is I'm just going to hide it. It's just there as a stand-in object to give me some collision. And you can apply that when you're doing more complex cloth simulations as well. You don't have to have a character that, every little nook, cranny, and contour is going to collide with your cloth. You can set stand-in items that will do some of the collision for you to simplify things. And then those things will just hide at render time. And it's going to make your solve easier. It's going to give you an easier time working with your cloth. So that's a lesson you can apply to more complex scenes as well. So we've got that one set to 10, that one set to 10. Let's go down here to the ground. And we'll also set this to 10, though the ground is going to leave us a fairly large gap anyway. And we're going to fix that once we have done the simulation and everything is all working. All right, so now at the default settings, I'm just going to go ahead and hit play down here. So let's go ahead and hit play, and we'll see that it falls down, and it looks kind of like a rubber sheet. All right, it lands, and this is that object penetration I was talking about. You see we get the sphere poking through. Not a big deal, especially because this is obviously not what we're looking for. So let's actually stop here, and I'm going to do the playthrough that goes through the timeline, so that second play button. So it'll just loop once it gets to 120 frames, so we can get a little bit better look at it. All right, so as this plays back, what I'm going to do is actually select this, and let's look at some of the options that we have here when we're working with soft bodies. Now, this stuff is also going to apply to closed soft bodies, so things that are more like a closed mesh. This we're dealing with kind of a simple sheet, so a simple piece of cloth, but these are also going to apply with closed soft bodies, which we will look at in another episode. So stiffness bend. This is just kind of the overall bendiness, if you will, of the entire object. So this can go from all the way from 0 up to a value of 1, and this is going to just basically control how saggy the material is in general. So if I set this down to here, let's actually go down to 0, and you can see that the cloth kind of flops more. Now there is going to be an issue that we'll have if we set this all the way down to 0, especially once we get to a higher resolution and we play with the other settings here, and that's going to be that we'll actually see a lot of inter-object penetration. So between the object itself. So the cloth is going to start crossing over itself. Some of that may happen regardless of how we set this up once we get the settings looking the way and behaving the way that we want in general. But we want to try to avoid that as much as possible. So going all the way down to 0 is usually going to be a little bit too saggy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this, even you see going up to 0.001, we no longer get these pieces just kind of collapsing into a V. So you can see there is 0.001. Here's 0. You can see we go all the way down to like a point here. And if we had more resolution and our other objects or our other settings were lower, this part would start to cross over. So let's go up to 001. You can see we actually get a little bit of kind of overall form to the object. So that's going to be good. That's going to be what we want there. And we may adjust that later here. Now, one thing also to remember as we start going through these is that this is an iterative process. process. You can't expect to just go one down the other, boom, 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 enter values, enter one, adjust it, enter the next one, adjust it, enter the next one, and have everything be perfect. You'll end up going back over these a bit as you increase resolution, as you increase the resolution of the solve with the number of clusters, as you change other items here in this simulation. You're going to see things that you're going to have to go back and adjust other settings. Okay, so moving on. So the stiffness bend is kind of, like I said, your overall bendiness of the actual material. Now, struct and shear are really very similar things, and they're kind of flip sides of the same coin. These are going to be how the overall shape is allowed to give and flex. And struct is going to cover kind of the give and flex along edges. So along the actual edges of polygons that are existing, this struct is going to allow this bendiness. So you can see we've got a relatively straight line here through there, and that is going to be caused by the struct. Shear, on the other hand, is going to be how each individual polygon bends within itself. And what it does is it kind of draws an X through the polygon, so you end up with like a pyramid or an X kind of shape here, and it will allow it to bend across those two diagonal edges. So it's as if it's making 4 triangles out of each polygon. And then those are allowed to give and flex, so you don't end up with just completely flat polygons anymore, but those polygons themselves will give. We want this to look fairly soft. I want this to look like cloth, maybe a kind of nice medium thick piece of cloth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to decrease both the struct and the shear. So let's take the struct, and I'm going to put it all the way down. The minimum is 0.05 actually on both of these. So let's put this down to 0.05, and we'll let this loop around again. And you'll see that all of a sudden we no longer get those straight lines where we have these edges. Those start to collapse, but we still see straight lines diagonally, and that's because our shear is still set to 0.5. So if we take the shear now and we put it down to 0.05, it's not going to make a big difference until we actually run through the sim again, but there you go. You can see we start to get a little bit more collapsing of this, but now we're actually hitting up to resolution limit, both of our current mesh and for the number of clusters. So I'm going to increase the number of clusters here. Let's start just by going up to 64, and we should see a little bit of improvement here. Yeah, a little bit. We see a little bit more kind of noise and softness through there. But now one of the issues we're seeing is that when the cloth hits the ground, it's not sliding in any, and that's because we have a high friction value. So 60% friction is pretty high. Let's take this and decrease it to 10. And you'll see a little bit of a difference right away, but as the sim reruns, you'll see that it's going to slide a little bit more. And then I'm also going to take the friction on the ground here and set it down to, let's go to 20%. So we don't want to go all the way down, but we definitely want to go lower. All right, so there we go. We start to get something going on. And now that we kind of have a little bit of the feel that we're looking for, and what I'm looking at here is just the general way that this does bend where I do have the resolution. So you can see I have the resolution through here to see this kind of arc shape, that arc shape. I don't have enough resolution going down these diagonal edges. So we'll have to actually start increasing the resolution of the solve and of the mesh in order to get in more depth. So kind of taking step one, we've gotten our things adjusted. Now we're going to move on. So let's go ahead and undo or stop our playback by hitting escape. And now what I'm going to do is move over to Polygon Mode, and I'm just going to move over to this cloth item here, and I'm going to press Shift D to subdivide this. I want to make sure I use faceted because that's just going to draw each quad into 4 quads. It's not going to try to round anything, so we'll do that. And now we've essentially doubled our resolution in each direction. Okay, so let's go ahead and hit play again. So you see, in this case, it's still going to be relatively quick in its solve, but you can see I am getting a little bit more lag in my movement here. If you pick that up on the video, I'm not sure, but it's definitely slowed it down a little bit. You can see we're starting to get something that looks much nicer here, okay? That's starting to fit the bill for looking cloth. And what you can do is you can take this and you can really bump this up, as you feel comfortable. So let's go ahead and undo that, or stop the playback rather. And I want to really, I'm going to up this again here. So let's go ahead and Shift D again. And now we're looking at 4,096 polygons, whereas at the onset we were only looking at 512. And then I'm going to do this one more time. Shift D. And so now we're looking at a fairly dense mesh. And now watch what happens here. I'll go to kind of a top vantage point. As the cloth starts to hit the sphere, we'll start to see these little subtle secondary wrinkles and things play through. And that's kind of what we're looking for. And that's what adding this kind of resolution is going to help with. So I did go ahead and hit play. It'll take it a second to get everything buffered. And now it's actually going to start playing. And now you notice my frame rate has dramatically dropped. And that's okay. We don't expect great and amazing things to happen instantly. You know, it's going to take a little bit more time. Now you can see we start to get these little secondary ripples and things come through. Overall, this is looking a lot more clothy. And keep in mind that we're still just dealing with a flat polygonal mesh at this point. This is not sub-D'd. And we'll sub-D it at the end, though, because we want to actually have that smoothness, but we don't want to apply the sub-Ds until we have the cloth doing exactly what we want. All right, so I'd say that's starting to look pretty good. Let's go ahead and stop that. And what I want to do is I'm going to actually take this cloth here and I'm going to move it up to kind of give it a little bit more falling speed, so it has a little bit more momentum as it hits the sphere. So it's going to drag in the cloth a little bit more as it wraps around under the sphere. So again, let's go ahead and drop that, and let's go ahead and play this back. And again, it's going to take a second to buffer. As soon as you see this stuff show up in the bottom left corner of your viewport, you know that everything is actually starting to work here. So let's let this go here. And we're just going to let it start to play through. It's going to look pretty much the same here, but what we'll see is we'll get more kind of wrap around underneath the sphere because the cloth has a bit more momentum accelerating with gravity a little longer before it collides with that sphere. So you see, again, there's those secondary wrinkles, and we start to see all these other ones here coming from the corners as well. Now, some of those are going to be problematic because they're actually poking through our kind of our ground plane, but we'll clean that up in a moment when we actually make a more render-ready asset out of this. And okay, I think this is working well, but again, we need to check our resolution of our actual number of clusters here. So I'm going to take this now, and I'm going to increase this to 256 because now we're getting a much more dense mesh, so we want more density in the solve. And I'm also going to increase this stiffness bend. I'm going to go up to 0.01. And let's go ahead and play this again because I don't want it to be quite as saggy. I want there to be a little bit more play throughout it and a little bit of force behind the fabric itself. So again, now we've increased our number of clusters and all that kind of thing. Sometimes this is going to make your computer hang. Usually, at least in the times that I've done this, this is not going to be a fatal hang. So, and it's going to be different depending on if you're on Mac or Windows. On Windows, it's going to give you the straight up not responding. But if you give it a moment, it's actually going to play through. So don't start clicking wildly, you actually will crash it. And you can see, there we go. We're actually getting our simulation running now. So it didn't really crash. It was just getting everything cached up in the background. So no worries if it starts to pause there. Don't fret. Don't start clicking wildly on the interface going, oh no, it froze. It really didn't. It's just hanging while it's figuring everything out. All right, so here, let's go ahead and deselect our cloth so we can see it a little bit more clearly. And we can see as it hits the ground, we get these extra ripples kind of bouncing out because there is a little degree of bounce going on here. And, you know, this is starting to look pretty much like something that I'm happy with. So the next thing that we'll actually want to do here is cache the simulation. So this last button here is going to run the cache through. So let's go ahead and go frame 0 to 120, click OK, and this will actually bring up a status bar. And what this will do is actually apply it to the timeline. So now we'll have something that we can scrub through. We can find a frame in particular that we like. And you can either freeze that and bake it down to keyframes, or what we're going to do in this case is we're going to freeze it at a given point in time where we like it and we're happy with it. This would be like if you're going to use something for a product shot or something like that where you want to have something framed with cloth and you want to put the cloth in. You don't want to have to take time to sculpt it or anything like that. This is going to be kind of what you would do there. And in future episodes, when we look more at soft bodies, we will actually go in and look at some other applications for them. So this is running the simulation. It will usually take a minute or less, but we're going to go ahead and pause, come back, and then we can actually see this in a scrubbable timeline. All right, so now that has actually run, and now what we can do is if we actually just click and drag through here, we can see our actual simulation. We can drag it all the way down to frame 120, and we can check out and see how this is going. Now at this point also, I'm going to temporarily put it into subdivision surfaces, and then I'm also going to hide the sphere so that we don't have to see that underneath there. All right, so here you can see that, we've actually got something that looks pretty nice here. And, depending on how you're going to want this to look, you can choose any frame along here and you can freeze it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find a frame. What I'm going to use this for is actually just rendering some cloth, which actually, as a side note, is going to be our next episode. We're going to look at rendering cloth. So I'm just going to find a nice frame here where you get a fair amount of detail, because I'm really only going to look at this from one angle. So let's find a nice spot here, maybe somewhere about there. So I'm looking around frame 112. Actually, let's go down a little farther. See, at frame 120, we're not looking like it's resolving any more than I like. So really, I kind of like how it is right here. So let's go to frame 112, and then all I'm going to do is I'm going to unsubdivide this first, and that's going to be important because if we have it subdivided and we freeze, you have to go and make sure that you uncheck that it's not going to freeze the subdivisions, and I find it a pain to have to go and turn off settings that you would probably turn on later, especially if you can just unsubdivide and then resubdivide. So let's go up to geometry, and I'm going to go to freeze, and then let's go ahead and click OK. And what it's going to do is it's going to kind of bake this down to a single frame. It looks like I ended up choosing frame 113, but that's okay. So here is our geometry now. Let's go ahead and subdivide it again. And we can see that we've got something that's looking pretty good here. Now, we do have two main issues. One issue is that we may have a little bit of overlapping polygons at some point. Actually, no, it looks like they stayed apart there. No, we're mostly okay. All right, so the issue that we're left with here, if we move over to the quad view, is that it's hovering, a few millimeters above the ground. So, like I mentioned, I'm going to use this as just kind of a scene item for, something like a prop. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to clean this up so that it's sitting squarely on the ground. So let's start just by going over to Polygon Mode, and I'm just going to grab this whole guy here. And let's zoom in on this front view. And I'm just going to pull it down so the bulk of the object here, we can see where we've got flat edges, are sitting right about on the ground plane. We can see we've got this edge here extending off. Maybe we'll go down just a tiny bit more. So something like that. Okay. Now, you could do this with background constraints and things like that. I find this to be too much to really deal with. I like to just take a little bit more of a modeling approach to this. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to right click and drag around. I'm starting at the origin. I'm moving around to the origin, and I'm just selecting. Oops, I was a little bit high on this side, or a little low. So here, let's go origin to origin, essentially. There we go. So now I'm selecting all of the polygons, and wow, let's do it one more time. Here, let's maximize this view. Give ourselves more resolution here. So I'm going from right here on the right, looping around, and what I want to see is I want to see that dotted line go right through the origin there. And you might go just a hair higher above it. This you may do a couple times just to get the feel for it. But there we go. So basically what I'm doing is I'm selecting everything underneath. Then I'm going to go to my scale tool, and I'm going to set my action center to the origin. So we're scaling towards the origin. And let's go back to our view here in 3D. So you can see this is all the stuff that's hanging underneath the actual the ground. So I'm just going to take this and I'm going to start by flattening it out. And what you may want to do is you may want to play with turning negative scale on it. You can actually kind of have it flex up above the ground. I don't know if we need that in this case. I think it actually looks all right. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and drop the scale tool. And then I'm going to move around and just check all these areas that I pulled up and make sure that I wasn't creating any additional polygonal overlap. And in this case, it looks like we're really not. Everything looks pretty clean. What you can do if you do have any little overlapping is you can hop over here to the paint tab, and what I like to get is a combo of the push brush and then the smooth brush as well. And what you can do is you can just kind of go through here and you can use the smooth brush. So let's say we had some areas that were overlapping, let's say right here we happen to have some overlap. You could just use the smooth brush, and I like to set my offset really low, something like 10%. And you can use the smooth brush just to kind of smooth things out. I didn't have any overlap there, so it just kind of made a little bit of a mess of it. So just back up. And then you can also use this to add in extra little kind of character folds and things that you may want. So, you may want to just go in through here and, just add little bits of just kind of raises in the fabric here and there. This is where it becomes a little bit more artistic, and pre-cloth simulation, this would be what we'd be stuck doing the entire look of this in, would be just adding this kind of thing in. Now keep in mind, I'm not doing like a multi-res sculpt here. I'm just sculpting on the polygons themselves. All I'm doing is using this as kind of a glorified soft move. And that's just helping me. I'm just kind of moving around where I actually kind of see little bits of the grid poking through, and I'm just kind of bringing those up. Oops. Let's zoom out there. So that's all that we're doing here at this point. We're just doing a little bit of general cleanup on this. And then the final thing that I'm going to do on this is just have something that's a little bit more render ready. I actually want to give it a little bit of thickness. So here, let's hop over to the model tab. And then we're just going to grab this again. And then we're just going to grab this. I'm going to use the thicken tool. And since this is already P-subs, it's going to be rounded at the edge. So I'm just going to click and drag this up just a tiny bit. I mean, a couple of millimeters. This is something like cloth, so I don't need it to be super thick. I think at most about 5 millimeters should be good. But I just want something with a little bit of thickness, and that way I have a little more render options to deal with when I'm actually working on this. And I need to just kind of take a quick tour around while the thicken tool is still active, and I want to make sure that I didn't cause any additional overlapping. If you do see overlapping, you want to increase your max smoothing. My max smoothing is set to 180 degrees, so I'm not really going to have too much in the way of overlaps. If you're set to the default, which I believe is like 44 degrees or something like that, you may have a little bit of overlap. You want to check areas like this where we've got some tight creases and everything looks okay, so we're probably all right. But if you have this set to a lower amount, you may need to increase your max smoothing to 180 degrees to be able to make sure that you don't get any kind of strange crossing over polygons, and things will pop and just look in general not right. So there we have it. We've got a basic cloth sim. We've looked at some of the basics of running a cloth simulation, some things to look for, and now we've got something that we've turned into a renderable asset for a scene. Just one last thing to note here, let's hop back over to the setup tab, is that when you're looking at your cloth simulation items, I don't have this up anymore because this is no longer a cloth sim. Actually, it still has everything turned on, so we can, well, let's see here. Let's look at this. Yeah, there you go. We still have it turned on, though no sim is being run. We've got all of our settings here. Keep in mind that all of these are animatable. So there's a lot that you can do by changing some of these over time. Not so much things like the number of clusters or things like that, but you can adjust some of these parameters, especially these three here: stiffness, bend, struct, and shear. Friction are also things that you can animate over time. And when we look at closed soft bodies, we'll also look down here. This also can apply to cloth like we've done here, but we have some things like pose matching and whatnot, pressure and drag. Those will take more effect as we look at a more in-depth look at some of the other options available with soft bodies in a later episode. But just keep in mind, you can animate those. It's worth playing with. Remember, start with your resolution low to minimize your frustration. Reduce the number of crashes. As I'm running through this, I should note, Modo didn't crash at all on me. It hung up that one time as we were running the higher resolution cloth sim, but it didn't crash on me. And a part of that is approaching this in a way that's going to be, start with the overall general idea, low resolution, get the look that you're going for, get the overall feel. Think about it working with a small piece of cloth. Let's work with something that's sheet of paper size. You can get an idea how that's going to bend and flex, whether it's silk or whether it's cotton or whatever the case may be. You can get an idea of that with something that's sheet of paper size. You don't have to throw a 20-meter tarp over a house in order to see how that cloth is going to behave. So start low resolution, get the settings that you like. incrementally bump up the resolution, check and adjust your settings to make sure that everything is still working. Remember, I ended up moving up my stiffness bend a bit, but making those corrections as you increase the resolution is going to save you from going and saying, okay, let's make a huge deep high resolution piece of cloth and then change our settings and then go back and change settings. That can cause crashes because you're going to be changing more variables than you need to, and that's something to avoid. This will minimize frustration, will allow you to get some decent looking render production kind of cloth done in a reasonable amount of time with a minimal amount of crashes. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the video description. If you like this training and training like this, go ahead, like, subscribe, visit my Patreon account at patreon.com/Ellery, or if you'd like to get the actual assets, the scene files for this or any other episode of Modo with Ellery, you can also check those out on Gumroad. That's gumroad.com/Ellery. Those links will be in the video description. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.